In today's episode, join us as we continue our discussion about cacao. Host Dr. Plotkin sheds light on the often overlooked contributions of Maria Sibylla Merian, a pioneering naturalist whose groundbreaking work in the Amazon predated that of many famous explorers. We'll also hear from Dr. Plotkin about his favorite episodes from the Plants of the Gods.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin, an ethnobotanist with the Amazon Conservation Team. It's a rainforest conservation organization that has had the honor and privilege to partner with over 90 indigenous groups in the Amazon forest to map, manage, and improve protection of Amazon rainforest and Amazon rainforest culture. You can find us on the web at amazonteam.org. So let's turn to the first European explorer of the Amazon, who I'm fond of describing as the greatest scientific explorer of the rainforest that nobody's ever heard of. She can accurately be characterized as an aged, unemployed, and divorced German housewife before she embarked on her epic journey into the Amazon jungle. Many ascribe the beginning of the scientific exploration of the South American rainforest to the dashing, educated, handsome, and wealthy Alexander von Humboldt and his colleague Aimé Bonpland, who ascended the Orinoco River in Venezuela in February of 1800. Following the trail they blazed into the rainforest were such eminent scientists as Martius and Spix, starting in 1817 in the Brazilian Amazon, Charles Darwin himself in Brazil's Atlantic forest in 1832. Note that Darwin never made it into the Amazon. The great and underappreciated Alfred Russel Wallace in the Amazon from 1848 to 1852, and the entomologist Henry Walter Bates in the Brazilian Amazon from 1848 until 1859. Also remember the great botanist Richard Spruce in Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru from 1849 to 1864, and he was the personal hero of my mentor, Richard Schultes. And he was followed by the ichthyologist Louis Agassiz into Brazil from 1865 to 1866. Missing from this august lineage is an almost forgotten woman who worked, collected, observed, and illustrated in an almost forgotten country. And not only was she the first scientific explorer of the Amazon, but she did the first and most accurate scientific illustrations of the cacao tree, from which chocolate is derived. More than 100 years before Humboldt and Bonpland set foot on the South American continent, that German naturalist had been there before them. But unlike von Humboldt, Maria Sibylla Merian possessed no great personal fortune, nor had she received any formal university education. In fact, at the time she set sail for the rainforest, as I said, she could have accurately been described as an aged, unemployed, and divorced German housewife. What she shared with all the great explorer naturalists that followed in her footsteps into the Amazon was a passion to immerse herself in the unknown and to document the life history of the unstudied plants and animals and even some of the people that dwelled within. Merian was born into a family of artists and printers in Frankfurt, Germany in 1647. She became entranced with nature at an early age, first with flowers and then with insects, particularly caterpillars and moths, beginning with silkworms, which she started raising at the tender age of 13. At a time when many believed that insects arose spontaneously from plants or rotten meat, she proved by lengthy and detailed observations that caterpillars' metamorphosis into butterflies and moths, publicizing a richly illustrated book on the subject at the age of 22. Following a brief and unhappy marriage, she moved to Amsterdam in 1691. And remember, we've been talking about how and why the Dutch were breaking the Spanish monopoly on chocolate, Amsterdam being a crossroads of the tropical world. In Amsterdam, she earned a living selling botanical paintings, taking advantage of the Dutch passion for nature, particularly for art and flowers. At the time, the Dutch Empire was flourishing in both the New and Old World tropics, and Amsterdam was the global crossroads, as bizarre and beautiful plant and animal specimens poured in from both the East and the West Indies. And remember, as we discussed in the coffee episode last season, this was essentially the Dutch century, when Holland was home to the world's most successful businessmen and the leading artists. Meanwhile, the dazzling colors, bizarre shapes, and enormous sizes of the tropical organisms that poured into Amsterdam from her tropical colonies inspired Merian to visit, observe, collect, and paint them in their native habitat. On July 10, 1699, she set sail for Paramaribo, the capital of Dutch Guiana, today the independent nation of Suriname, making Merian the first European woman and one of the first Europeans to embark on a scientific expedition into the Amazon rainforest. Although north of the Amazon basin proper, Suriname, British Guiana, now Guyana, and French Guiana are part of the same great rainforest ecosystem as the rest of the Amazon. An important note here. Most think of the Amazon as the Amazon basin, but that simply is not true. The Amazon basin is composed of 6 countries through which the Amazon River flows. The Guianas to the north, that is French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana, and to some degree Venezuela to the west, are not part of the Amazon River drainage, but they are part of the Amazon forest ecosystem. So the Amazon basin is 6 countries, but Amazonia is 9 countries. Unlike Brasilia, Bogota, Caracas, La Paz, Lima, and Quito, the capital cities of the Guianas, that is Cayenne, Georgetown, and Paramaribo, are located within the Amazon rainforest, meaning that Maria Sibylla Merian in Paramaribo was well situated to collect, study, and illustrate plants and animals seldom seen by the outside world. Not only were her paintings of the species exceedingly accurate, but the interactions between the plants and the animals she documented was simply revolutionary. Merian illustrated ecological interactions and struggles between Amazonian organisms over 150 years before the German Ernst Haeckel first coined the term ecology, and over 160 years prior to Darwin's publication of his immortal work on the competition of species for survival. In other words, she was describing ecology and ecological interactions before those terms existed. So precise were her paintings that nearly 3/4 of the butterflies she depicted can be identified to the genus in which they are now classified, and over 66% of those can be identified to the precise species. The great Linnaeus himself, the father of scientific nomenclature, and the fellow who named the genus of the cacao tree Theobroma, that is, the fruit of the gods, considered her artwork so accurate that he used them as the basis for describing dozens of new species. And Merian illustrated biological interactions that were so unusual that they provoked ridicule among some of her peers. Her famous depiction of a tarantula devouring a hummingbird was not deemed credible until entomologist Henry Walter Bates, a male, recorded a similar incident with 2 finches in Brazil almost 150 years later. Likewise, her painting of the cacao tree showed the cacao fruit springing from the tree stem. It was not deemed believable by botanists with PhDs who had never been to the rainforest. Once again, Maria Sibylla Merian was right, and the men were wrong. Her powers of observation were astonishingly acute. With respect to ants alone, she noted that some Amazonian ants build bridges with their bodies, while others carry leaf pieces into underground burrows, and some can quickly strip vegetation. These were undoubtedly among the first accounts of leafcutter and army ants. Merian's observations on agronomy were similarly sophisticated. She produced some of the first paintings of cacao, cashew, cassava, and pineapple, and unsuccessfully attempted to convince local planters to cultivate these species to diversify beyond their sugarcane monocultures. And I'm going to point out that not only were these the most accurate scientific depictions of the cacao tree to date, but the only illustrations that had come before that were relatively accurate were the depictions created by the Aztecs themselves. Merian's precise itinerary in Suriname is no longer extant, but we do know that she traveled and collected as far south as La Providence, a plantation 50 kilometers up the Suriname River, south of Paramaribo. Her collecting efforts were aided by local Amerindians and enslaved Africans, who were undoubtedly fascinated by the novelty of a European woman who had ventured into their rainforest and wanted to learn from them. Again, that's the secret of a lot of ethnobotany, that is, successful ethnobotany. Indigenous peoples are usually unaccustomed to meeting outsiders, particularly Westerners, who arrive with a humble attitude, wanting to learn from them. Merian demonstrated her respect for these people and their knowledge, recording their names and uses for local species, thereby carrying out some of the very first ethnobiological research in the entire Amazon rainforest. These interactions with local colleagues brought forward another and less appreciated aspect of Merian's personality, little noted in most biographical sketches: her humanism. As a single woman from a foreign country, she might have been expected to keep her critical opinions of Dutch planners and the colonial system to herself, but she fervently condemned their treatment of local enslaved peoples, foreshadowing Charles Darwin's similar sentiments over a century later when he wrote movingly of an Afro-Brazilian woman who committed suicide rather than face a life of slavery. I might point out this is covered in more detail in my most recent book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know. Merian wrote, quote, "The Indians, who were not treated well by their Dutch masters, used the seeds of the so-called peacock flower to abort their children so they will not become slaves like themselves. The black slaves, originally from Guinea and Angola, have demanded to be well treated, threatening to refuse to have children. In fact, they sometimes take their own lives because they are treated so poorly and because they believe that they will be born again, free and living in their own land. This they told me themselves." End of quote. Moving words, indeed. Heartening is that, over the course of the past few decades, Sibylla Merian has begun receiving the recognition she so richly deserves. Germany has featured her countenance on their currency and on a postage stamp. Many schools have been named after her. A German research vessel, the RV Maria S. Merian, was named in her honor. Numerous recent museum exhibitions and websites celebrate her art and her pioneering spirit. On April 2nd, 2013, which would have been her 366th birthday, she was honored with a Google Doodle. While her scientific contributions are increasingly celebrated, a much more widely known figure in the history of chocolate star has waned. While Sibylla Merian was a humble commoner who opposed the slave trade, Sir Hans Sloan was a rich and famous Anglo-Irishman who owned investments in the Royal African Company, which played a prominent role in the transatlantic slave trade. Furthermore, he married a woman whose family owned sugar plantations in Jamaica, and the profits generated from this evil business financed at least some of his travels and scientific collections. Born in Ireland in 1660, Sloan was a man of wide-ranging interests, two of which were medical science and natural history. Despite his unsavory connections to the slave trade, he was regarded in his day as a towering figure of British science and medicine, so much so that he eventually served as personal physician to both Queen Anne and King George. In fact, he was elevated to the Royal Society at the age of 25 and to the College of Physicians just 2 years later, evidence that he was considered a leading light of the establishment at a relatively young age. He eventually served as president of both organizations. From an ethnobotanical standpoint, however, The most interesting aspect of Sloan's career was his being sent to the colony of Jamaica as the personal physician to the governor of the colony. His wide-ranging interests led him to collect hundreds of botanical specimens, medicinal uses of plants, and even the music of Afro-Jamaicans, meaning that he was one of the first ethnobotanists and ethnomusicologists in the New World. He actually recorded musical scores and lyrics. More importantly for our purposes, he was fascinated by cacao, then little known in the British Isles. Remember from our rum episode that Jamaica was originally colonized by the Spanish, who probably brought the cacao tree to the Caribbean from their Central American plantations. Sloan noted the local uses of cacao and cacao products in Jamaica, both as a medicine and a food since, as we now know, cocoa is both a stimulant and a mood enhancer. He was widely celebrated for inventing chocolate milk. At the time, as was the case with the Aztecs, cacao was usually mixed with water. Of course, as so often happens, scientists credited with major breakthroughs and discoveries were in fact merely recording local customs, as there is ample evidence that Jamaicans were mixing cacao and milk before this British nobleman discovered, air quotes, discovered this custom. Think of the case of Edward Jenner, widely celebrated as the discoverer or the inventor of vaccination. But if you read deeply in those accounts, he learned it from milkmaids who didn't get smallpox because they'd contracted cowpox and scratches they had while milking the cows. Alexander Fleming won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of penicillin, but several accounts point out that local midwives kept moldy bread on their windowsill to prevent infections. So as Sloan is supposed to have discovered chocolate milk, as Jenner discovered vaccination, as Alexander Fleming discovered antibiotics, local, less celebrated females in many cases got there first. In fact, my mentor Richard Schultes often said, we ethnobotanists don't really discover anything. We merely record what our local guides and teachers show us. Nonetheless, Sloan was an insatiable collector of biological specimens, geological samples, artifacts, books, and manuscripts, not only the ones he personally collected in Jamaica, but from other Caribbean islands as well. His vast collection formed an eclectic assemblage that was purchased by the British Parliament in 1753 and served as the nucleus for three of the world's most enduring institutions, the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum in London. So these two figures, who played an important role in the history and ethnobotany of chocolate, the Dutch-German Sibylla Merian and the Anglo-Irishman Hans Sloan, left indelible legacies on Western art, culture, literature, and science as well. Meanwhile, however, her contributions are increasingly celebrated, while his unsavory association with the despicable slave trade will forever tarnish his legacy. So as an added treat today, I was asked to comment on one of my favorite episodes, since we have over 5 seasons available of Plants of the Gods. And of course, asking somebody who runs a podcast what are their favorite episodes is a bit like asking a parent which are his or her favorite children. But let me highlight a few of my favorites, even though they're all my children, it feels like, and I go back and listen to as many of them as I can over time. My first and most important is the very first episode, ayahuasca, and that is because it was through the magic of ayahuasca, through the legacy of my mentor Richard Schultes, that I first discovered in the ethnobotanical sense, this magical vine. And this seems to be a view shared by many of our listeners who often cite ayahuasca as their favorite episode, and it's been downloaded more than any other episode through the course of more than 5 seasons. My second favorite episode is that of the life and times of Richard Schultes. Schultes was my mentor. Schultes is widely known as the father of ethnobotany. I took all of his classes. I worked with him. I studied under him. I actually lived in his attic for a while. So I think I have a perspective on him which is pretty much unique. but he's a marvelous person, aside from being an ethnobotanist, kind, considerate, and he loved his plants and he loved his indigenous teachers. And he continues to inspire a generation, or I should say at this point, generations of ethnobotanists, not just fellow Schulte students like Michael Balick or Wade Davis, but people who are studying his legacy and didn't really know or have the opportunity to work with him in person. Another particular favorite of mine in terms of episodes is that of absinthe. And absinthe I call an ideogen. An ideogen, if a hallucinogen makes you hallucinate and an entheogen makes you discover the God within, then an ideogen is something which inspires new ideas. And this is one of the underlying stories of the Plants of the Gods podcast across the board, that these plants and fungi and frog slime that help us enter into altered states also help us to bring new ideas or to generate new ideas. And certainly absinthe is one of them. It's not usually featured in books or articles on hallucinogens or mind-altering substances, but if you drunk as much absinthe as I have, being from New Orleans, you know that it is indeed a mind-altering substance and really can inspire new ideas. The last episode I want to cite as one of my faves, and I know this one was a fave of my friend Tim Ferriss as well, is that of Plants of the Apes. It details the story of how primates, primarily apes, use plants for medicinal purposes. This was inspired by a conversation with my old friend Jane Goodall, who's on the advisory board of the Amazon Conservation Team, when I was talking about some work I was doing on the ethnobotany of wine. And she said, humans aren't the only ones that drink wine and enter into an altered state. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, my chimps like to get snockered. They wait for the marula fruit to ferment, and they catch a buzz. They eat these things, as do elephants, as do other creatures. And that inspired me to look further into which animals were consuming fermented fruits and in so doing consuming alcohol. And I found that it was everything from elephants to fruit flies. So that is another episode which is proven extremely popular. In fact, I told the story in my second book, Medicine Quest, In Search of Nature's Healing Secrets.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out other episodes, from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team at www.amazonteam.org.